Judy Morgan and Richard Senerchia have been friends of mine for at least a decade. And they are both very active in the climate crisis movement, in helping Judy and I organized, and we are not any longer a part of, but we organized a climate group that Leonard has now taken over the fight that Tim Beckham was in. And Judy has worked in the past for the New Jersey Department of, sorry about that, Environmental Protection, doing environmental education. And Richard and Judy both ran a sustainability club under the auspices of Weaver's Way for quite a while, which was incredibly interesting and really helped people with doing individual action that they could take to be more sustainable and live more by the kind of lives that really help to eliminate waste. So Richard is going to do the presentation, but they both worked on it.
Share. Thank you, Merle.
Mm-hmm.
We're gonna share the screen so you can see our PowerPoint.
Okay.
There, oh, there she is. Are we ready here?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Well, you know who that is. That's Maya Angelou. And I really like this sentence of hers: do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better. Because that's a pretty good description of we're all kind of learning as we go along, and we keep learning new things. In fact, we looked through our talk, which we gave here at Cathedral Village. We gave it about a month ago, and there were some things that were already a little out of date. So in sustainability issues, things change fast. So you do have to keep your ear to the ground, and that's why I like that quote. We had this little problem earlier.
A little technical problem.
Okay.
Sorry.
We'll be back to that in a second. Screen sharing has stopped. Okay. Okay, from the beginning, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Please stand by. We're having technical problems.
There we go.
Okay, now let's see if this works. Ta-da! Okay, so there's 3 topics we're going to talk about tonight: plastic, regenerative agriculture, and you might not know what that means, but you will, and electric vehicles. First, I want to acknowledge Judy's help. She did a lot of the researching and drafting a lot of this presentation. And my daughter Helen is a soil science expert, now getting a master's from Penn State. And she was very helpful, particularly with the agriculture part. We are not experts, Judy and I, but have spent considerable time digging into the latest thinking about these topics, just so you know. So the biggest obstacle to achieving sustainability is the business as usual mindset, also known as, but we've always done it this way. It's like this joke. The guy falls off the roof of a tall building. As he passes the 10th floor, he calls out, "Everything's okay so far?" Plastics, then. Well, why would we use plastic? Because it's durable, it's waterproof, it's lightweight, and it's cheap. Where does it come from? 98% of plastic is currently made from fossil fuels. And that's a problem, as you know. Where does it go after it's used? 5 to 9% of plastic is recycled. Does that surprise you? That's a very low number. But an awful lot of plastic that we think is getting recycled isn't. It's just being incinerated or landfilled. 15% of the plastic that's produced gets incinerated and 75% gets landfilled. A surprising amount of plastic ends up in the ocean, which I'm sure you know. You've heard of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, for example. Now, that's to the tune of 8 million tons of plastic per year. That seems like a lot, but that is only 0.5% of the plastic that's produced every year. Tiny particles of plastic are shed as the plastic age. As plastic age, that doesn't sound right to me. As plastic ages, plastics mostly don't biodegrade. They break into smaller and smaller pieces. So every toy that you had when you were a child is still out there somewhere. It may be in a million tiny little pieces, but it doesn't go away. Organic things go away. Plastic is not organic and it doesn't go away. And that's a problem. That's quite a pile of plastic. 400 million tons of plastic waste every year worldwide are produced. That amount has doubled over the last 2 decades. So 20 years ago, the world produced 200 million tons of plastic, and now it's up to 400 million tons. It contributes to greenhouse gases. 3.4% of greenhouse gases causing climate change are produced by the production of plastic. There was a word there that I can't read. What does it say? This? Uh-oh. Barbara Hoffman entered the waiting. Let's let her in. What'd you do?
So we're trying to get this out of the way, is that right?
Well, there was something that I couldn't see there. I think you're gonna have to go back to the escape thing. And slideshow from beginning or from current slide. I don't care. Current slide. There. Well, whatever that said. Oh, from fossil fuels. That was the word. Now, landfill plastic waste takes many years to break down, if it ever does. Hello? It causes damage to aquatic ecosystems. We're all familiar with the problems for marine life. For example, plastic waste kills or harms fish and other marine life. Estimates are up to 1 million marine animals are killed by plastic each year.
Oh, no.
There are health concerns about plastic. It keeps breaking into smaller and smaller particles. Microplastics are defined as smaller than 5 millimeters in size, down to 1 micron. Well, 5 millimeters is about 1/4 of an inch. A micron is 1/100th of the thickness of the average human hair. So that's pretty small. And that's a problem because they're getting everywhere. They have both been discovered everywhere in the world and in most organs of the human body. Nanoplastics are small enough to enter the bloodstream, the lung tissues, and the brain. They're so small that technology has only recently been developed to identify and to study them. Columbia University published a study in 2024 describing a new technique for assessing concentrations of nanoplastic and their findings of surprisingly high concentrations in bottled water. Nanoplastics are small enough to enter the bloodstream and the brain and can pass through the placenta, so they're found even in the bodies of newborns. Some of these particles, because some plastics carry toxic additives that are used to make plastic more flexible, more durable, more transparent. 3 of those are bisphenol A, or BPA, phthalates, and perfluorinated chemicals, or PFAS. And they may irritate tissues and make them more susceptible to diseases. These toxic chemicals are known to cause cancer, endocrine disruption, cardiovascular, and other health problems. It's not really clear because they've only been able to observe Oops. We'll be right with you. There we go. They've only been able to observe harmful impacts in high concentrations in laboratory animals. In low concentrations, the impact on humans isn't known, and that's important because a direct causal link is needed before the FDA can ban them. The FDA is concerned, but says it cannot currently place limits on microplastics found in food. And I don't know about you, but I feel like if they fired a lot of the people at the FDA, they're going to be able to do even less. The European Union has banned BPA in food contact materials as of December 2024. So there is concern about them, but in America, we can't do that much about them. Single-use styrofoam is banned in all those states: Maine, Colorado, New York, New Jersey, Vermont, Virginia, Washington, and Washington, D.C. There are less harmful alternatives to styrofoam, but they're still problematic. PET is the type of plastic, but it doesn't have some of the problems of other types of plastics. And so it's considered a safer plastic. Compostable containers are appearing in various places, paper products, plant fiber disposables, and more. So there are alternatives, but again, we've always done it this way. Investigative reporting showed that industry, that is the plastics industry, knew from the beginning that recycling would only hit a small percentage of plastic, which turns out to be 5 to 9% of plastic, as I said earlier. Why is it so small? Well, only a few types of plastic can be truly recycled into other plastic products. Most are too expensive or impractical to recycle, and there's no market for them. Each type of plastic has different melting points and other properties, so they can't be blended. If you have a bag that contains potato chips, for example, it's got more than one kind of plastic in it, an inner liner and an outer liner. They can't effectively or cost effectively be separated and reused. The industry says, well, there's something called chemical recycling that would be a better solution. But this means breaking down plastics into small particles and reassembling them. The problems with this is that a lot of energy is required to do that, and the plastics that are created have the same problems. They're non-biodegradable, they shed particles, they damage marine life, etc. We have a rug in our bedroom that is made from recycled bottles. But of course, it does have the problem that it's probably shedding small nanoparticles into the atmosphere here. And when we're done with it, it's going to go into a landfill, but it's still plastic. So recycling is not the answer. There are on the market now things called bioplastics or degradable plastics. They can be based on plants, such as corn or potatoes, rather than fossil fuels, and they're seen as the green alternative. If you go to Weaver's Way, you can get in the produce department, they have these green bags that are compostable. Well, the problem is producing the plants that go into these bags requires a large amount of farmland, which, by the way, is not an unlimited resource. They often include toxic additives, which are spread as they break down into particles. Some of them biodegrade only under certain circumstances, so they're impractical or environmentally undesirable. We tried for a while in our backyard composter, putting these green bags in there, and what happens is they just break into smaller and smaller pieces, but they don't go away. So the truly environmentally healthy alternative, the only one that really makes sense, is to minimize your use of plastic. Well, you can use natural products instead: paper, cardboard, wood, natural fibers, etc. Sometimes in some restaurants I've seen, they are now giving you takeout containers that are not made of plastic or styrofoam. They're made of paper products. Not surprisingly, Europe is leading the way. The European Union in 2021 banned most single-use plastics, including plastic bottles, plates, cups, utensils, food containers, bags, etc. The European Union also set targets for a reduction of plastic packaging. And as you can see from the numbers there, it's a kind of a step-up approach to it. And as of 2030, there's some single-use plastic packaging will be banned in Europe, including, and this strikes me as really weird, but you can go to the supermarket and see individually wrapped potatoes wrapped in plastic. It seems like they're trying to use plastic for more and more things. Well, they are, because the fossil fuel companies own a lot of petroleum reserves, and with cars using less and less gasoline, which we'll touch on again when we get to electric cars. When cars using a lot of they're losing their market, so they're looking for ways to make more and more things out of plastic. This takes a certain amount of vigilance. You have to keep your eyes open and look for alternatives. In Europe, there is broad public support for banning plastic. Over 80% surveyed in 2024 agreed it is important to ban unnecessary single-use plastic products. There's, for example, in the way of alternatives, you can buy things wrapped in paper instead of in plastic. I have a bamboo toothbrush. The bristles are made of nylon, that's true, but the whole handle of it is made of bamboo, which will biodegrade. And do you remember when you were young and you could go collect bottles off the street and take them to the store and get deposit money for them? Well, there's a number of European countries and states, 10 US states have adopted deposit return schemes. In Germany, this has been extremely effective. The return rate is 98%. In US states with these deposit return schemes, the recycling rate is 70%, but without states that don't have recycling or deposit return schemes average 33%. So there's definitely a difference. The federal government in the last administration released a strategy document that acknowledged the serious threat of plastic pollution and called for plastic reduction in federal agencies and their programs, but it fell short of calling for legislation restricting plastic production. And now that the administration has changed, God knows what's going to happen. The UN, though, is committed to a global plastics treaty. The UN Environment Assembly unanimously adopted a resolution to create a treaty to end plastic pollution. So they're working on this. The Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee meeting to develop a global plastics treaty failed to reach agreement on a final text, but the negotiations on the treaty are continuing. Now, what can you do? Well, you can support legislation to reduce plastic and increase alternatives. You can join or donate to an environmental organization focusing on plastic, like the World Wildlife Fund or the Plastic Pollution Coalition. You can avoid using plastic products. Where you can, find alternatives. In the picture there, you can see those plates and that flatware. I think they're made of bamboo. I'm not sure about the plates. Well, you can use reusable products where possible. Take a reusable mug to your local coffee shop. Here at Cathedral Village, they have a coffee hour in the lobby, and they give you, can you see that?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's one of the cups they give out there. It looks like a paper cup, doesn't it? However, it's lined with plastic because so that it won't leak. But I was walking up to the lobby one day a couple of weeks ago, and there was a fella carrying an empty mug with him. I said, well, where are you going? He said, I'm going to get a cup of coffee. He brought his own mug, so he didn't have to use one of theirs. That's the kind of change in awareness that we really need. You can buy clothing made of natural fibers. Synthetic fibers shed microplastics when they're washed, and those microfibers get into waterways and the ocean. Did I mention earlier that they have found nanoplastics at the top of Mount Everest and at the bottom of the Marianas Trench, which is 7 miles deep? So we really are surrounded by plastic. You can educate others, which is what you're doing right now. You're educating yourself. The fossil fuel and plastic industries are actively promoting plastic. Did I mention this before? Public awareness is urgently needed so that people get to thinking of plastic as just not normal. That would be helpful. So before we go on, I need to know if there are any questions that I have raised that we could possibly answer. No.
We can take questions at the end. I don't know how to
Okay.
get back to this gallery.
We're going to go on. And if you do have a question, we'll come back to it later.
I have a question,
Oh, yes, Leonard.
sort of. So California passed some kind of a law, which I don't recall exactly, but basically what it said was that it gave the plastic manufacturers a certain number of years to get their recycling numbers way up. And if they didn't, they would have to come up with a solution, right?
Huh.
I mean, so
That would be very helpful. And I think a lot of companies are not going to do anything unless they're forced by government regulations to do it. We saw that with tobacco and with automobile emissions, didn't we? And it's probably the only practical way to deal with the plastics problem. Okay, so now we're going to talk about regenerative agriculture. You may not know what that is. There's different kinds of agriculture. There's conventional agriculture that uses heavy machinery and synthetic fertilizers and pesticides. There's organic agriculture, which doesn't use synthetic fertilizers or pesticides. And there's regenerative agriculture. This approach seeks to improve the soil, the water quality, the biodiversity, and the ecosystem as a whole, which is really not quite true of organic agriculture, although that could be a side benefit. What's wrong with conventional agriculture? In a word, if you go to the grocery store, it's full of food. Why is there a problem? Well, it's a problem because it's unsustainable, especially when you factor in the world of climate change. Climate change will create rising temperatures and changing weather patterns, which will result in lower crop yields due to water scarcity, drought, heat waves, and flooding. Besides plants, livestock will also be affected by heat stress, by lack of water from drought, by disruptions in fertility, and changes or the reduction in animal feed. Many pests and diseases will become more prevalent or widespread to new regions. For example, poison ivy. Poison ivy loves the new climate. It thrives on the extra carbon dioxide in the air. And if you walk in the woods at all, you may have noticed there's more and more poison ivy. So that's the kind of thing that we should be concerned about. A conventional agriculture is also unsustainable because of reliance on fertilizers and pesticides derived from fossil fuels, genetically modified seeds, which are expensive and controlled by a few big companies. And then, of course, there's mechanized equipment, which uses fossil fuels and compacts the soil, which is not good for growing things. Conventional agriculture relies on irrigation, which increases the salt content of the soil. Groundwater is more saline. It has more salt in it than rainwater or fresh water does. And when you use it to irrigate, then the water evaporates or is absorbed and the salt is left behind. And little by little, the ground becomes saltier and saltier. And that results in a significant loss of already scarce farmable land. And of course, conventional agriculture practices monoculture, which creates problems. And if you think about the Irish potato famine, you can see why that causes problems. Monoculture, here's the definition: growing a single crop over a wide area for consecutive seasons. It simplifies farming operations, but it reduces biodiversity and fertility and increases dependence on chemical inputs. And then there's the banana. Bananas are all clones. That's just the way they grow. And there was a banana called Big Mike, or Gros Michel, was the predecessor of our modern Cavendish banana. That's the one you see on the left there. They were wiped out by a fungal disease in the 1950s. And whoever owned the copyright to Yes, We Have No Bananas probably made a lot of money from that. But the rest of us are dependent on bananas being there, and they're not going to be there forever because the Cavendish banana is just as susceptible to that disease as the Gros Michel was. So one of these days, there are going to be problems in the banana industry, and that's because of monoculture. And of course, there's erosion. The World Wildlife Fund says half of the topsoil on the planet has been lost in the last 150 years. Good topsoil is disappearing 5 times faster than it's being replaced. And mainly it gets washed away and or blown away in erosion. The Dust Bowl was a great example of erosion, for example, because they had plowed up the prairies and then the soil dried out and the winds blew and blew the topsoil away. If you have a New York Times subscription, and you can look this up, A Climate Warning from the Cradle of Civilization, it's a very interesting photo essay about Mesopotamia, once known as the Fertile Crescent. Once so fertile, it has been suggested as the model for the Garden of Eden. That's it right there. It's a desert now. It's the kind of thing that we can't allow to happen, but it's really up to us. So, conventional agriculture is unsustainable. The solution is regenerative agriculture. What does that mean? Regenerative agriculture is not so much a system as a philosophy based on new understandings about soil health. I can't explain all the things that are going on in that picture, but they show you that microbes in the soil are a critical part of the ecosystem, and they're required to keep plants healthy. So you can't just plow everything up and poison everything, because ultimately that's going to lead to disaster. The principles of regenerative agriculture, because it's, as I said, it's more a set of principles rather than, sorry, lost my place, rather than a system. Well, these 4 principles are important: to regenerate soil health, because healthier plants suffer fewer problems; promote biodiversity, and these days, we hear a lot about the pollinators and how they're disappearing; to conserve water and to store carbon, which is important for addressing climate change. So how do you do that? Well, this is a list of 7 regenerative methods that are being used, but there are more, but this is just some of them. But these are the ones I wanted to talk about. Cover cropping, intensive rotational grazing, no-till farming, composting, reduced or no fossil fuel inputs, polyculture, and conservation buffers. We're going to take these one at a time rather quickly. Cover cropping may be familiar to soil covered, especially with living roots, best way to prevent erosion. Intensive rotational grazing. What you do is you move your grazing animals from place to place, and as they go, of course, they fertilize the ground, and they by moving them off the ground, it gives the grasses a chance to regrow. No-till farming means growing crops without disturbing the soil through tillage. It's true that, for the past 4,000 years, people have prepared to plant things by tilling the ground, but this is perhaps not the best idea. By growing crops without disturbing the soil, you can keep microbial communities and root systems intact. This decreases soil erosion, which is caused by plowing. As I said, the Dust Bowl. Crop residue from the previous year is left on the topsoil and serves as a mulch. Polyculture is the opposite of monoculture. In agriculture, polyculture is the practice of growing more than one crop species together in the same place at the same time. 3 examples. 3 Sisters, which if you haven't heard from, you will soon. Alley cropping, which is growing crops in rows between trees or shrubs. Say, for example, if you've got an orchard with lots and lots of peach trees, there's space between them, and you can grow things in that space rather than just leaving it all, or God forbid, dousing it all with pesticides. Anyway, and then there's integrated fish and rice farming, where the fish feed on pests and weeds, and they fertilize the growing crop of rice with their waste, one at a time then. The 3 Sisters. This was practiced by the Iroquois Indians in America since the 1300s. What you do is you grow corn, and after the corn reaches a certain height, you plant beans at the base of the corn. Now the beans use the corn to grow, so you don't need trellises. It grows on the bean stalks. And corn is a heavy consumer of nitrogen, and beans add nitrogen back to the soil because they're legumes. So this is really a great solution. And then if you plant squash plants among the corn, the squash plants have big leaves which keep the soil cooler and also inhibit the growth of weeds.
How do you harvest it all?
You have to harvest it by hand, Myra, and that's an issue. That's a lot of regenerative agriculture practices are more labor intensive. And well, that's part of the reason why conventional agriculture is developed in the first place, is to make it possible to grow food with a minimum of labor. I feel like with so many people, labor is not going to be an issue. Do you know what I mean? I read somewhere that the Chinese had machines that could have built the Great Wall of China, but they didn't use them. And they didn't use them because they had so many people. Anyway, so it's true, it has to be harvested by hand. It's also true that the beans and the corn are what they call complementary proteins, which is to say that you get more nutrition eating them both together than you would if you ate them separately. So there's that. Let's go look at, this is a picture of integrated rice and fish farming from Java. Those fish, I believe, are tilapia, and they're growing in the water in the rice paddies. They're living in there. And so you can harvest the fish and you can harvest the rice, and the presence of the fish increases the production. What am I trying to say? The presence of the fish aids in the production of the rice. Like I said earlier, because of the fertilizing they do and eating pests and things like that. Everyone's familiar with composting, right? The natural process of turning waste into fertilizer. Then there's reduced or no fossil fuel inputs. This is kind of a no-brainer. If you don't use pesticides or fertilizers, you're going to be building healthier soil and leveraging other natural systems to help manage pests. For example, ladybugs eat aphids. Aphids are bad, and ladybugs can eat them. So you can buy ladybugs and release them in your farm fields to help cut down on your use of pesticides. There's a few pictures of good bugs there. And then there's something called conservation buffers. These are areas of land populated with various plants to act as windbreaks, to control erosion, flooding, and runoff, to provide habitat for wildlife. So there's some sort of a stream or something there, and all along the banks, they have plants growing that are going to prevent runoff and cut on wind, which is one of the big factors in erosion. And it's good stuff. Now, this is an interesting picture. That's depleted soil on the left from a conventional farm versus healthy topsoil on the right. So, to sum up, the difference between conventional agriculture and regenerative agriculture is that conventional agriculture works against nature, subduing it and outsmarting it to provide us with sustenance, while regenerative agriculture works with nature, seeking to understand how it works and how to work with it to provide us with what we need. And that's the big difference. Is it gaining acceptance? Well, yes, it is. As of a 2023 survey, 90% of farmers were aware of some regenerative farming practices. 68% had adopted reduced or no-till practices, but unfortunately, fewer than half had adopted other regenerative practices, so there's still work to be done. We're going to pause a second to admit someone who's just arrived. Okay. Agribusiness realized that the trend to depleted and eroded topsoil cannot continue. Within the last few years, they've largely embraced regenerative agriculture as the way of the future. Very positive development. And if you think about it, they're not tree huggers. You know, the people in agribusiness are just trying to make money. And they've realized that regenerative agriculture is a better way to make money than conventional agriculture. General Mills recently pledged to use regenerative practices on its operations by 2030, on 25 to 35% of its operations by 2030. It started a large pilot program of remote sensing over 175 million acres, which it sees as key in scaling up regenerative agriculture to large-scale farming. There is a need for refined feedback on how crops and soil are doing to manage them ecologically, and that's what they're doing. These other companies are making similar large commitments to regenerative practices. Mars is the candy people, Mott's is the apple people. Walmart actually sells a lot of groceries. I don't know what Unilever and PepsiCo are doing there, but I'm sure it's good. So some claims may be greenwashing. You're familiar with that term, I guess, claiming to be eco-friendly when only making a token effort. But most believe that the large amount of money being invested in regenerative agriculture will ramp up acceptance in a major way. I feel like very reassured by that because these companies are not going to invest in something if they don't think it's worth it. So what can you do? You can buy organic, which is an important step towards regenerative and now widely available. You know, when I was young, in the 60s and 70s, I read about organic gardening, and a lot of people in the industry said, it's never going to work. It can't work. You can't feed people that way. But now, if you go, you can go into any grocery store and you'll find a section of organic fruits and vegetables. So it really has made an impact. Now you can find out if there are local regenerative farms or markets near you and buy there. We in Northwest Philadelphia are very lucky to have Weaver's Way. Did you know that Weaver's Way is the largest farming operation in the city of Philadelphia? And they practice regenerative agriculture on their farms, and they sell their produce in their stores. So it's good. It's, you know, we're lucky that way. What else can you do? You can support legislation and policies encouraging regenerative agriculture and local small farms by joining or donating to organizations like Rodale. Did you know that Rodale's headquartered right here in Pennsylvania, by the way? Regenerative Agriculture Foundation, and I think I mentioned already Weaver's Way. So that's what we have to say about regenerative agriculture. Before I get into electric vehicles, is there anything that you'd like to ask? Or should we just forge ahead? Electric vehicles. Full disclosure, we own an electric car, a 2019 Nissan Leaf, and we love it. It looks like that, except it's dirtier. So, did you know that you are living at the end of an era, the era of the internal combustion engine? That sounds crazy. Consider that, as Naomi Klein observes in her book on the climate crisis, this changes everything. The greatest obstacle to addressing the climate crisis is the business as usual mindset, like I said in the beginning, but we've always done it this way. But about the end of an era, vehicles that are powered by fossil fuels, such as gasoline or diesel fuel, are set to be phased out by a number of countries. There's a quote here that I want to show you. This quote here from Auto Week magazine of 2021, which is 4 years ago. Phasing out internal combustion engines, it's already happening. So this statement is already several years old, and it shows that EVs have been coming for a long time. And I'm very pleased to see that they have really made a commitment to replacing gasoline engines with electric. Now, there are concerns about electric vehicles, myths and misunderstandings, some of which are promulgated by the companies that don't want you to use an electric vehicle. Some of them are EVs cost more, recharging is expensive, batteries are expensive, and there's something called range anxiety. How far can you get before you have to recharge the car? they do cost more. But there are a number of inexpensive EVs. There are some listed here with 2024 prices. Nissan Leaf is $29,000. The Mini Cooper SE is $32,000. The Hyundai Kona electric is $34,000. EVs have lower maintenance costs, 50% less than similar gas cars, depending on the model. That's according to Consumer Reports. But if you think about it, you don't have a muffler, you don't have tune-ups, oil changes, catalytic converters, fan belts, or coolants, among other things. The cost of recharging, well, we're going to get to that in a minute. Fuel is less expensive for EVs, about 40 to 60% less, depending on local cost of electricity and gasoline. So recharging at home is cheap, roughly 3 to 5 cents per mile if you're using the ordinary house current. Recharging at commercial chargers depends on the charger. Here at Cathedral Village, where I live, charge point chargers are charged 25 cents per kilowatt hour, which works out to about 7 cents per mile. And there are things called fast chargers, which don't use ordinary alternating current, they use direct current. And you can get, well, you're going to pay 30 to 60 cents per kilowatt hour, which works out to 8 to 16 cents per mile. The cost of recharging is lower per mile than gas. And our experience, we get about 130 miles per charge for about $7. And even if that were not so, the environmental cost of internal combustion engine cars remains high. Think of the increasing and increasingly costly climate disasters. Somebody's going to have to pay for that. And, you know, it's, if you think you're paying a lot for electricity, you're paying a lot more for mitigating climate disasters. You may have heard that replacing the batteries can be expensive. Oh, wait, let me tell you about this. There's the 3 levels of recharging that I just described to you. They're known as level 1, level 2, and level 3. Our car has 2 plugs, one for level 1 charging and one for level 2 charging. With level 3 charging, you can get an 80% charge in 20 to 30 minutes, but this is hard on the batteries. They tend to heat up. And so that's one reason why that's not a great solution. By the way, that picture shows where the batteries typically are in an electric car. They're under the floor. If you have heard that replacing the batteries would be expensive, well, most automakers provide battery warranties for 10 years or 120,000 miles, and the price is coming down. It dropped 89% between 2008 and 2022, and it continues to drop. Limited range is a problem, yes, but the ranges per charge is increasing. This is information about, well, by year, as you can see. The little white line in the middle of each green bar tells you what's typical median range for that car for electric vehicles offered for sale in the United States, as it says right there. And the number on top of each green bar is the maximum that you can expect. A word about plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, or PHEVs. It seems like a good positive, a good compromise. Because you'd have a gasoline engine as well as an electric motor. So, but the problem is most of these PHEVs have a much smaller range on electric power, 20 to 40 miles. And you still have all the maintenance issues of the gas-powered car. It's also true that according to insurance companies' statistics, that the electric vehicles tend to catch fire much less than hybrid electric cars, because the hybrid electric cars have more machinery packed into a smaller space, so there's a greater chance of fires. On the other hand, you can use the PHEV on road trips without having to stop and recharge. A Prius Prime PHEV holds about 10 gallons of gas. So, in conclusion about PHEVs, there's no good or bad choice. It's more a question of your driving needs and habits. If you had a fairly short commute, for example, you could, use the electric power only to drive that car, but you'd have to make sure you plug it in. One parting shot: if our culture does fully embrace EVs, then as time goes by, there will be more recharging stations and fewer gas stations. And of course, EVs are better for the environment. So we have seen things questioning the future of electric vehicles. And while it's true that the market has slowed in recent past, due to them being slightly more expensive, charging networks not developing rapidly, and because early adopters have already bought them. But in addition, Trump has recently blocked funding that supports electric vehicles. But the prognosis is still good in the long term because automakers have already invested billions in developing EVs, so they're not going to go back on that. Other countries are increasing EV production, especially China. Volvo of Sweden expects 90 to 100% of their sales to be plug-in hybrid or all-electric by 2030. Globally, electric vehicle sales are steadily increasing. This chart here shows that, and that red on the bottom, that's China. And you see how it's increasing dramatically. But the point is that EV sales by region are increasing all around the world. The coronavirus pandemic has slowed auto development production, but manufacturers' plans to introduce electric vehicles continue unabated. In fact, dozens of pure electric models are set to debut by the end of 2025, according to Consumer Reports from earlier this year. So they're not going away. And so you need to think about that. You might say to yourself, well, I'm too old to be buying a new car anyway. What do I care? But you have to remember that young people, maybe you have children or other young people, will be wondering whether EVs are a good idea or not. So it's helpful to be informed about them. Let's see, what else have we got here? Under Biden's administration, $7.5 billion was to be spent on funding 500,000 new charging networks by 2030. The Trump administration has paused this funding as of early February 2025, even though much had already been contracted. So all that is now held up in courts, and we don't know what's going to happen. It is believed that private enterprise will continue to build charging networks to meet the demand. However, progress will be slower. What you can do is learn about EVs and share information with friends and family. You can correct disinformation. People have heard that electric cars are a fire hazard. In fact, I said this earlier, they have a much lower rate of fires than gas-powered cars. You can support legislation encouraging clean energy in transportation by joining or donating to the Electric Vehicle Association or some other advocacy organization. And as Maya Angelou said at the outset, do the best you can until you know better. And then when you know better, do better. So that's everything I wanted to tell you. There's a hand raised. Now, Judy's going to see if she can figure out how to answer that question.
I have a question. You don't have to do anything.
Okay.
So you talked about a lot about recycling, and what about recycling of batteries? I think what's going to happen is that car batteries, what's going to happen is that a few years from now, when electric vehicles will be much more readily available, after 10 years, I think they will have to change their batteries, and this is going to be a problem. So what's your take on that, Richard?
My take on that is that the batteries, when they're too old or too weak to be powering an electric car, they're not dead. They can still be used for other applications. We have read about using batteries from electric cars to power up homes, for example. And I don't really know very much about that, but I know that there are people out there who are thinking, what are we going to do with all these batteries? And that is one hopeful thing that I encountered, is that you can use them for other purposes. Lawrence, that looks like your hand up, literally.
Yeah, I was just going to mention that when they took the battery out of my chair lift that goes up the steps,
Yeah.
they said they take them and they put them and they recycle them. They refill them with whatever they need to fill, and they recycle them. So, like maybe that's what they could do with the larger batteries like that come from the electric cars.
Could be. I don't know, but I would imagine there are a lot of engineering type people who are looking into that question, because that's a resource, really, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I hope that they can come up with creative ways of using them. It is one of the things that is being used as a scare tactic. People are going to say, well, there's not enough lithium in the world to power all these cars, and things like that. And I really don't know what the answer to that is. As I said, the best I can do is to hope that there are people trying to figure these things out. I have a feeling, if it were really a concern and really a problem, that we would not see the auto industry investing so heavily in electric cars, because they would be warned off it. But I don't know. Anyone else? Yes, Leonard. Leonard, you're muted.
So I think what people are going to figure out is how to regenerate the materials in batteries, and there are a lot of people working on that.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, you start out with all these precious things in the battery that makes them valuable, and but then they get mixed, but all you need to do is sort of separate them back into their components, the chemicals. I mean, it's not so easy to do, but I think that's where the science is going, and I know that there are people working on that problem.
Good. That's reassuring.
I have a question about no-till farming. So
Okay.
if all these big corporations are going into no-till farming, there must be a way of doing that mechanically. Do you have any idea what they're planning on?
Well, I just think that a lot of the big corporations are looking into various regenerative agriculture practices. I don't know how much they're looking into the question of no-till farming. I think that among the regenerative methods that we talked about, no-till farming is one of the most widely accepted, though.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen pictures of some farming machinery used for no-till planting, and it's got a long arm to the side, so the soil isn't compacted, and this little thing scoops out the soil, and another thing puts in the seed, that kind of thing. And so the weight of the machine is off to the side, so it minimally compacts the soil, just kind of strips.
Thanks.
Merle.
This is more of a comment. I heard today on public radio that because of the 25% tariffs on aluminum that are coming, that Coca-Cola and a few other companies are looking at going to all plastic instead of cans. And to say the least, I was upset, but I was wondering if some of the things that, if this is a question for anybody, if some of the things that Trump and his cronies are doing can significantly hurt the environmental movement enough that it really is going to be unstoppable, that climate change and.
Merle,
like-
before the election, we watched a program about the environment, and one of the speakers was Bill McKibben, and he said, when you consider that we have a very small window of time to do anything really effective about the environment, that if Trump gets elected, this was before the election, of course, if Trump gets elected, it's never going to happen. So
Well, it
I don't
doesn't
know.
mean we give up. It just means that it's going to be tougher, and we're going to see more climate impacts than we want to see.
Right. But I mean, it's
Let's raise his hand.
Leonard.
I think what he meant is that the targets, the Paris targets of 1.5% and 2% are not going to be attainable. And I think that might be right. And there is, of course, some risk that, we could get, a runaway process. There are, ways.
Yeah, what they call tipping points.
Right. But most climate scientists don't think those are likely. I mean, sooner or later we'll hit them, but right now, with current policies, we wind up with something like 2.7 to 3.2%, 3.2 degrees warming by the end of the century. So, now we're already at halfway there. And it's been pretty bad, but it hasn't been catastrophic in terms of, ending the human race or anything.
So that's good news.
Right.
And one of the things that we felt and talked about preparing this presentation is that, in a way, everything looks so bleak, it's really depressing to put all this in one place.
Well, but as we did the research, there were a lot of,
we did find there's more good news than you might think. And if what you're saying about climate experts not expecting to cross those tipping points, that's reassuring.
Like the fact that the agribusiness has jumped onto regenerative agriculture with both feet at this point, just in the last 3 years. It's just a radical shift. So that's very encouraging that there can be a pivot. Yeah, Leonard?
Well, first, I think Tim had his hand up.
He did. Yes, Tim.
Yeah. Well, thanks for calling on me. And I want to thank you and Judy for being such good presenters of these very important topics. The thing that I think we need to do collectively is educate and address these things most of us are older people. Mm-hmm. We can address our children, our grandchildren. We can address others. And we need to spread the word on this, because I don't think our president is going to be bothered with it, at least not very strongly. But we can, and I think if we just keep plugging away.
Yeah, there was a proverb, as it were, that we used to hear a lot. If the people will lead, then the leaders will follow.
Yeah, I think that's very much what I would hope for. But thank you very much. I appreciate your work. I'm going to leave.
Okay. Well,
we have to go.
Okay.
Well, thanks for being there.
Thank you.
Sure. And Leonard, you wanted to say something else?
Yeah. So one last thing is that what Judy said about how, agribusiness is getting on board with sustainability. I mean, the thing is, these are the industries of the future. right? Why are we so afraid of China? Well, because China is seizing the industries of the future, right? They're doing, most of the world's production of wind, air, electrical generation, and their wind and solar production. They're doing most of the battery production, and they're doing most of the electric vehicle production. These are there's no question that we have to shift from a dependence on fossil fuels to, solar energy. And so the industries that do that are the industries that are going to power the future. And what Trump and these other idiots are doing is making it even harder for the United States to compete in the future. So if you have children, tell them that if they want the industries of the future, they've got to get on board with climate change.
Reminds me of the situation which drove Borders Books out of business. They didn't recognize the importance of ebooks. So they didn't create a reader, and they didn't create materials so that people could use ebooks. And it wasn't very long before they went out of business.
Mhm.
Lawrence, do you have your hand up?
One other thought is that you didn't mention, the greenhouse type farming. Is there a sort of relatively new type of greenhouse farming that is being done now that uses a really low level of water? I think I kind of read something about that.
I don't know. I'd like to know more about it.
Well,
Why?
All right.
Hope.
there are places where they're using either abandoned buildings and refitting, or building huge things where you can automate the lighting, the water, the fertilizer, and not use soil. Whether these are sustainable or not, I don't think anybody has stated, but it certainly is going on in many places. I mean, a lot of the lettuce, for example, that you get is grown in a greenhouse.
Right.
Well, it'd be good to keep an eye on those developments and see where they're leading.
Mhm.
I mean,
There's
my
always
natural,
a trade-off between the water usage, the electricity, etc., that you're getting.
and yeah, my natural skepticism makes me wonder if this can possibly be as good as it sounds, but it may be. It'd be good to keep an eye on it.
Anybody else have a question or a comment? Okay, well, Richard and Judy, thank you so much for all of your research and all of your time that you spent on this. And it's really good not only to hear it from the two of you, but to hear other people who are, knowledgeable also, and to add their input also. So, and thank you very much for attending. So have a good rest of the night, everybody.